To be, to become, to begin, where the river leans to the sea. To learn, to let go, to love. The world turns endless, turning me.
This is the second conversation with Helena Norberg-Hodge. In the first, we built the foundation, how Helena sees the world and where that way of seeing came from. 50 years of returning to Ladakh, a life lived in many places at once, long enough to see the deltas. Today, we take that foundation and point it at one thing, food. Not food as one issue among many, food as the place where the whole story becomes visible. Who owns the land, who works it, who eats, and who profits from the distance between those things. Where we go next is harder ground. Who belongs, who is let in, and who gets called dangerous for wanting the local back. Here's Helena.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, what we did last time was that we set a foundation of understanding how you look into the world, and what we found, what I noted in particular is at a very central element is an ongoing multi-point global grounding that you represent, right? You're in many places and you're grounded in these places, right? And this gives you a different kind of perspective. Because you can see the deltas, you can see changes over time because you've been doing that for decades.
Yeah.
And that is a very, very unique perspective, and leads you to see that we should be in a very localized way to be treating for caring for each other and caring for our world around us immediately, right? So that's what I take in a very dense essence.
Yeah.
Um, and
And I mean, I
what
think
mm,
you should add to that
yeah,
it
please.
gave me a deep understanding of the growth of this very concrete, I mean, almost
Mm.
literally concrete buildings that they inhabit,
Mhm,
of this
mhm.
rising power of global banks and corporations.
Yeah.
And that they, as a very real and embodied force are something we need to understand and focus on.
Mhm,
When we talk about
mhm,
capitalism and so on,
mhm,
it can all be too vague, and we're often entrapped in a view of that as some kind of inevitable outgrowth of innate human greed and so
mhm,
on.
mhm.
But to understand that distinction between the people who inhabit that world and the people who are grounded in community and on the land, yeah, that's what I think I
And I
have to.
and I think this is a perfect starting point for what we want to focus on today, which is food systems, agriculture, caring for the land. Because to me, this is one of the places where you can see that dichotomy that you were just describing most clearly and in a very, very pronounced way.
Yes.
And so when I look at what the current um, food system does, the industrialized food system, it is of course an amazing driver for GDP in so many ways. Because if you count the externalities, I mean, don't let's I'm not sure about those numbers, but it's in the trillions of what it adds to GDP in a shadow form, right? Through healthcare, through the chemical industry, through all sorts of industries that are attached to it, that or are second and third order effect fixers of the damage done by the agricultural system. So um, that is a really good starting point for that, exploring that dichotomy. And then on the other hand, we have the people on the ground trying to actually care for the land, because they understand that that is where life comes from. That is what life actually is, for at least from the perspective of the human experience. That's where it starts. So let's explore that whole big complex today a little bit.
All right, very good, very well framed. And I think this is exactly as you say. It is such a useful and clear way to understand what's been going on. And it's also the most important issue to focus on if we are interested in trying to support positive change that would heal both people and the living the rest of life. And so again, my view on all this definitely started in Ladakh, where small-scale settled agriculture had been sustaining people for thousands of years, and it had been doing that in one of the most difficult environments on this planet, up at 12,000 feet, and sometimes even a bit higher, and in an area that only had 4 inches of rain a year. And that was snowed in for often 8 months of the year. So a very, very tough and difficult environment. And yet people kept, passed on parcels of land through families. So it was passed on from generation to generation. So in that sense, there was land ownership, but there were also common lands, and the commons, again, were maintained peacefully and in an ongoing way for thousands of years. And they also practiced transhumance, so that animals were taken up to higher pastures, again, commons, up at 18,000 feet or even higher, where the animals would graze in summer, and some of the villagers went up with them and lived up there. And I have to say that life up in those high pastures in the summer, it was a bit like paradise. It was just incredibly beautiful with, the glaciers and this crystal clear meltwater from them, and it looked like desert, but you literally had edelweiss and, little flowers and other plants, and the animals were grazing over vast areas. They were sort of semi-wild, and they were very, very cool, the yak, and then the zoo, which was a blend of the local cow, which was a rather small, very fit, wiry and trim cow, but then these larger zoo that were a hybrid of the cow and the yak, and lots of goats, hundreds of goats, donkeys, some horses, and the people living up there, the spirits were so high, and they were playing, flutes and had games that were a bit similar to chess or something on stone plates with moving the stones, and they had, all the generations from the youngest to the oldest, and they would be they had slept in these very small, dark stone sort of cabins, but at night would be telling stories around the fire, and it was blissful. And that way of life was sort of the first to be abandoned, considered the most primitive. And as modernity came in, because you were also handling dung, they were collecting the dung and bringing it down as the major source of fuel. So it was very, if you like, very primitive, very basic, but worked incredibly well. And they also gathered small bits of scrub vegetation. And then the farming was done with using animals. So the particularly the zoo, this blend of the yak and the cow, are very often used to pull the plow. And then at the time, so during the planting season, and people would be singing. They not would be, they sang as they did that. And then at the time of harvest, it was also just unbelievable, vital, joyous time when the threshing would be done by animals. Sometimes even the goats would join, maybe horses, yaks, or a whole train of animals going around the threshing. And behind them, there would be someone singing to them and urging them to work hard, because once that got over, they could have a lovely time eating fresh hay and so on. And they would have, at the same time, at somewhere else nearby, someone would be cutting the wheat or the barley and singing other songs. And then when they were winnowing, which they did by hand, they'd be whistling. So you had this whistling, you had this singing, different types of singing. And then usually in the houses at that time, the monks would have come to do special harvest ceremonies, and you would hear them singing and chanting, not singing, and with different instruments. This long horn, I don't know if you've seen that very long Tibetan horn that would
No,
reverberate
know
through.
them from the Alps.
Yeah,
Similar.
and sort of similar. Maybe I'm going into too much detail here, but yeah.
No, I love the
detail.
picture. I love the picture. No, I don't think so. I love the picture you're opening because it gives a very vivid image of what it could be like. I have some questions, and it's first of all, I want to draw a parallel to Norway, maybe, because if I've had the pleasure of spending some time in the mountains in Norway at in a cabin. You might know it. It was built by Arne Næss in a long time ago.
He was a friend of mine. I knew him very well. Yeah.
Yeah, so you might have been up there. I've been at in his cabin a couple of times, but it reminds me of the way the agriculture in Norway used to work. Going to different pastures, up the mountain in summer and then going down again, and being quite like almost nomadic, but with fixed spots to go to,
Yeah.
maybe sometimes even two stations depending on the climate. So it was a very intelligent way to deal and integrate all the opportunity and possibility that is presented, even though it might seem scarce, right? And up at Arne's hut, it's really scarce, right? But still, he spent a lot of time up there in his life, right? 14 years in total. So, and so finding intelligent ways of showing that actual thriving is possible, regardless of where you are. I think these are really, really good examples. And then one of my favorite, which you probably know, is this amazing book by Fukuoka called One Straw Revolution, in which he
Yes.
lays out how he experimented over also, I think, decades, how he could, with the minimal effort, create the same yields as industrial farming out of the same size of plot of land.
Yeah.
In his case, it was rice, and with zero fossil fuel inputs and hardly any work, right? So it shows that really intelligent into being with nature actually gives us everything we might need. Um, the
Yeah, and I think it's very important,
Gotcha.
that point that you can actually get more out of the land through
Mhm.
many people involved in the caring and the learning and the production
Mhm.
than we can with the machines and the whole fossil fuel modern agriculture did never produce more food per acre of land. It
Mhm.
produced more food with fewer people. So it destroyed the
Mhm.
jobs on the land, and the
Mhm.
jobs became more and more horrible, really, spraying lots of chemicals, sitting on top of a big machine, essentially removed everyone from nature. Even the people who were on those machines, on the land, were not actually in nature. And so nature then becomes this sort of enemy that you have to fight and spray. And
Mhm.
whereas the opposite, which existed traditionally and which is reemerging now, is as much diversity as possible and as many people on the land as possible. But to me, this is one of the most important things we have to understand about the economy is that
Mhm.
it has been built by elites who have been continually replacing people with energy and technology, and they have
Mhm.
embedded in the marketplace fake prices that tell us that it is cheaper to use lots of fossil fuels and chemicals and technology. And if we do that, both in the growing, the processing, even for the supermarket shelves and the transport and the plastic and the refrigeration, all of that will still deliver a supermarket product for a lower price than something that comes from 5 miles away and that used very, very little energy, but was actually produced through loving hands and hearts and eyes that could see what was happening. And that is what we have to change. And it's a big ask, but
Mhm.
it's not something that the majority of people would actually be against if they understood what the choice is. But we have a small elite that's still insisting on seeing the world through a haze of numbers and not looking at the reality and just and benefiting, accruing a lot of wealth by insisting that technology has been so incredibly helpful.
There are two questions that I have really around this. So one, I want to tackle that first, which is it came up while you were describing the life in Ladakh and how land was passed on from generation to generation. Now, if the population stays stable, that's possible, right? If it doesn't, you need to capture more and more land.
Yeah.
So what in
Yeah.
the so first of all, does the population or did the population stay stable?
Yes.
And what in the culture of the Ladakhi made that so?
Yeah. It was the great respect for Tibetan Buddhism and giving the monks a nice status and nice buildings. And so it really worked quite well. It's often described as feudal, and it's probably rather similar to what happened in medieval Europe. But what I know from experience is that in this particular instance, it worked very well. And the idea that this was some kind of exploitation by the monks and Rinpoches is just nonsense. I mean, I
Mhm.
think many of us would see it more as a slight deprivation, that they didn't get to have lots of sex and give birth to children. They had a nice time doing chanting, meditating, and providing, religious services to the villagers. But these were people's brothers, uncles, fathers that were in the monastery. And there was a close relationship, and the monks depended on the villagers, not the other way around.
Yeah.
And so,
That's so
that
clever.
was
I've
how
never
they
thought about
managed to
that.
do. Sorry?
Religion as population control by creating monks. I love it. Never
Yeah.
thought of that. Hmm.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah.
And nuns. There were also
Hmm.
nuns. And the nuns got to live in the house with the family. And that Westerners who came in later saw that as a deprivation and started funding building nunneries for the nuns,
Hmm.
because they should also have the
Hmm.
ability to only meditate and not have to deal with ordinary life. My take on it is that women generally are more social and thrived
Hmm.
on being part of the family, enjoyed
Hmm.
looking after the young children, as well
Hmm.
as spending time with religious rituals a bit more than the others. So it all worked quite well. But the point today is that whatever the population is, replacing them with scarce natural resources is not an intelligent choice. And the
Hmm.
fact is that because we've been doing that for generations, there is so much reparation that needs to be done by these individualized,
Hmm.
caring ways of doing things. And that's what makes me very happy with my work, with my life, is that by having promoted that, I'm in touch with so many wonderful people around the world who are struggling against the tide, but as they engage with that life affirming direction, and particularly in that local food movement around the world, they find so much joy, literally physical healing as well as emotional healing, while they heal the land. And to be able to come, whether it's in Japan or Korea or in many, many countries where I've been active, to come and see land that was barren, that had been raped by fossil fuel chemicals and machines, suddenly thriving. Very often within 3 years, you would see huge improvement, and 5 to 7 years, amazing, night and day.
Hmm.
So that's, yeah,
But
that's what's wonderful.
you said something that I think is very key, and it ties to my other question. So, you essentially said it's healthy and joyful to do that kind of work, but we have convinced ourselves that it's actually the opposite, right? It's hard work.
No, we have not convinced ourselves. We have been persuaded by the elites,
Okay, so let's make that distinction. We have
by the
been
masters. Yeah,
persuaded by the masters, and I think at one point we will have to establish who they are and how they
yeah,
become into that position. But
yeah,
let's leave it at that first. So we have been convinced that sitting at a desk looking into a screen is somehow superior work, and that anything you do physically is lower and is harder and makes you less happy. But in reality, I experience the exact opposite, right?
yeah,
Anybody doing things with their hand, and even if it's a steel worker, here with the ship, when we're on a shipyard to do some work on the ship, I find those people so much more joyous than the startup scene of Berlin, right? And I see that again and again and again. So, um, to me, a very interesting question is, how is it that we seem to not be able to rid ourselves of that story, knowing that we need to counterbalance our sitting in front of screens by trying to go into nature, by having to go into Vipassana retreats on the other side of the planet and doing Ayurveda things, and everybody's hopping all over the planet all the time to recalibrate themselves just because they've been sitting at the screen for too long. How is that
Yeah.
possible to hold that dissonance without seeing what you just said? That's working with the
Yeah.
land
Well,
actually makes happen.
again, the holding of the dissonance, I really do see the way I would like to tell the story is that, well, I don't know. I don't know if I said that already, but for me, then the sort of very clear story that we need to tell is what started in the time of history when we have written records and we can see what happened, and we, see in a sense it's been recorded, written very clearly. We don't have to go back many thousands of years to see how did these civilizations arise, and why were there some people who were conquering others and robbing other cultures of their resources. We don't have to go back and theorize and speculate about that. We can look at what happened with enclosures and slavery. So, did we talk about that last week?
No, not that I recollect.
All right. Well, I think it's very relevant here. We're wanting to focus on the land and farming. Well, the key thing is that elite traders started pushing people away. So, what happened is that traders who were benefiting from global trade in slaves and goods, from Europe expanded this empire that started with the help of Christian missionaries and traders to rob others of their resources. And the missionaries were emissaries for this central empire to tell them that their worldview was inferior, that they were inferior. They needed to come, into this Christian superior empire. And I'm so aware also that destruction of self-esteem is fundamental. So this central empire has always functioned by destroying self-esteem and self-reliance. And the self-esteem and the self-reliance were never individual. They were community. We evolved in groups. And that's also a very important distinction. We evolved deeply, deeply connected, embedded with others in an intergenerational fabric. And we actually experienced, I think I talked about that. We experienced the 7 generations.
Mhm.
We talked about that last week, I
Yes,
think.
yes, we did. Yeah.
And we had that deep security in knowing that we could count on one another. It was a vessel that held us and kept us secure, and it prevented the sort of self-doubt and fear that emerges as we're cut apart into separate individual beings. So that fabric of interconnected ways of being, and as interconnected with the living land that also carried us, that supported us,
Mhm.
the water, the land, the trees, that was severed through enclosures and slavery. So on both sides of the world, in so-called poor countries and so-called rich countries, the history is that both were cut off from the self-respect and self-reliance, or let's say community bonds and community reliance. And then they became dependent on a growing empire. And as they were driven into the city, Dickensian London is what we see as the beginning of progress. So we were then fed the narrative. Look at what a mess. Look at the illness. Look at the pollution, the gap between rich and poor. It was all terrible because everything was broken down when people were pushed into that way of living. And you see, I feel like I've seen that literally in these last decades in the so-called third world. The Dickens London replicated as people are pushed into a place where the infrastructure isn't there, where the water is polluted, the rats are running around, and illness, the illness increases, and above all, friction and divisiveness, gap between rich and poor that grows bigger and bigger. So what happened in the West is that mess was tidied up with the help of technology. And so the narrative kept telling us how well we were doing as individualized beings and how the urban individual way of life was superior. And so, and I feel like I've lived through Victorian England in Ladakh in seeing people develop an attitude of a sort of self-hatred of their past and developing a sort of artificial boosting of this new role where they were clearly much less happy. And so I saw how in a place where depression hadn't existed, where suicide hadn't existed, step by step, people becoming more and more unhappy. And, and the truth of suicide now being, one a month and a young person. And so we really, really need to look at this honestly around the world, and we'll see a very similar pattern. So they're pushing us off the land into this fear-based competition. And I don't know if I mentioned last week that I also saw that greed is a common sense, intelligent reaction when you're pushed into a marketplace where you have no idea how much bread is going to cost tomorrow, because you have no idea who it is who's even delivering that bread, who's in control, where it's coming from. You have no control. You don't even have any vision over that. Of course, you're going to want to hoard money. It's a natural, intelligent reaction
Against
to
scarcity.
being pushed into insecurity. Any sensible person would want to hoard money. And so,
I want to I want to give a little example of how to maybe counter this culturally. There's a tradition where we live in Costa Rica, where around Christmas everybody makes tamales, and so you have a whole bunch of tamales at home. And whenever you visit a person, you bring tamales as a gift, which means that the amount of tamales you have at home roughly stays the same because you're giving away and you're receiving basically at the same rate, meaning the tamales get distributed across the entire community, and nobody has to suffer, right? So it's a symbol that embeds in us that the understanding of we are here for each other. We have no less if we share, right? In a very playful way, in one moment in the year. But I wanted to ask something else, which was when you described the two pillars of self-reliance and self-esteem.
yeah.
I want to explore that link a little bit, specifically in the question of food systems, right? So I can see the self-reliance part, of course, right? If I have a way to be self-reliant in my food system, that is probably a good thing. How do you see the self-esteem part coming into this?
Yeah, well, again, this is what I experienced. The self-esteem is much more connected to the very fundamental human relationships. And so when you, as a child, are always on somebody's body, I think we talked about that maybe last week,
Yes,
there are
10 people
so
caring for one.
many, it's the difference between a small nuclear family under increasing time pressures and, as we've seen, often mother alone and then often mother working, even the mother, and being sent off to a kindergarten. And the kindergarten couldn't be more monstrous. When you put 31-year-olds in a room with one adult, you've created elbows. You cannot help each other. So human beings never did that to each other until modernity, until this enslavement. And it's so beautiful to know how naturally people would cooperate if they were allowed to be free range, if you like, and that means the natural thing is that even a 3-year-old can help a 1-year-old to walk, and certainly the 5-year-old will. And the 5-year-old never says, "Oh, why can't I run as fast as my 8-year-old brother or my, 7-year-old neighbor?" Never occurs to them that they're not good enough, because they're in a fabric of difference, different capabilities, different ages, and they naturally, in that order, in that structure, respect the older. And so here we're talking about, fundamental things like learning to walk, learning to make things, learning to, and the natural reaction. We can even see it with our children. They like to imitate what the older do. But when that was part of a functioning economy of a daily life, where also that involved looking after young animals, looking after younger children. So one of the key things I saw is that young men maintain their caring feminine side, and probably, or I would say certainly, it has an impact on the hormones. That having known, how a dog we knew developed milk to feed a wildcat, I don't know that anyone has actually. There's so many studies I would love to do. We could still do to study some of this, even though it's almost extinct now. It's very hard to find any functioning culture that's still whole and that's still protected. So in some ways, we can't now do anything that hasn't. It's all been affected by the psychological brainwashing, the psychological warfare 24/7, which romanticizes the urban consumer culture. Did we talk about that last week?
No, but I like the frame of homogeneity as
Yeah.
a forcing function to remove self-esteem,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
I want to add one more thing
But
to
can I
your.
say,
Yeah,
but I
please.
just want to say also that what was so clear is that the adults and the older viewing the children were never putting expectations on them. They were appreciated for exactly the way they were. So did I talk to you last week about mothers not worrying if children can't walk by the age of 1? Do you remember?
I think yes. I think yes.
You see, that's all connected to the self-esteem. The mother laughed at the idea when she heard that in the West, mothers would worry if their child by the age of 1 couldn't. They just thought it was hilarious. Why would anyone worry? Of course they're going to walk. So what I saw was a true appreciation of true individualism. And we don't realize the extent to this thing that has been marketed as freedom. Individualism has actually been the opposite. And so that acceptance of exactly the way you are, which includes even if someone had some kind of physical impairment, no one would try to pretend that even though you have a damaged foot, you can run as fast as I can. They could laugh and joke about it. Oh, you can't do that because your foot isn't good. And in no way was that an exclusion. It was seen, it was recognized, and you were still part of the group. You were you still belonged. You were still appreciated. You were still loved.
Yeah, and I think there's an amplifying factor about the homogeneity in a kindergarten, which is you said rightly that children learn by imitation, right? By imitation and playing. And if you're part of a group of 1 to 3-year-olds, who are you going to imitate? The only interface you have to any imitation is your in-group, meaning if you are embedded in an actual village or in a community with diversity, there's much more that you can imitate. And you can imitate, if you imitate adults in what they do, you have much more opportunity for growth yourself, right?
Yeah,
That's also an
but
aspect.
also you have to remember that all of this is happening, the creation of the monoculture, and at the same time, messages about what you should be. And, one of them is cleanliness. Whether it was Victorian England or what I witnessed in Ladakh and many other places in our village in Spain, the advert for that absolute cleanliness, toxic soap powder, scrubbing everything. And this became one of the symbols of being part of the elite. And that, it's grown to the point where in America, living there, people, even compared to Europe, they sort of imprint meant that people would often be changing clothes in the same day, but certainly you wouldn't be seen dead wearing the same shirt 2 days in a row. And the sort of the pressure to conform to something unnatural, something more pure, something cleaner. And remember, it goes quite a lot with the imagery of God up in the sky, clean, clear, white, and the dirt and the dark, being the earth, the menstrual blood, all of it, the functioning body rejected. So,
Mm-hmm.
in Victorian England, they even covered up the legs on the piano. So
No.
that the rejection of the body, the rejection of the earth is a very fundamental part of the whole path of progress. And what's wonderful is that intuitively people are bringing it back. But I think if we had more clarity about what's going on, I know that we could be, progressing much more rapidly back home to a more
Mm-hmm.
natural and more joyful way of doing things.
Yeah, and uh, I think even if I'm in myself, I notice, let's say, prejudice of that kind sometimes that you were just describing, and just notice how deeply it sits within me. For example, when my wife taught me about effective microorganisms, to use them as cleaning support in our home. Now, that was so weird for me from multiple perspectives, although I I understood how that works, right? I understand how it works, but at the same time, um, uh, we have um, associate or associate something like microorganism with something dirty. That's what we've been told for a long time. And also, having brought up in quite a Calvinistic Protestant way, I don't accept things being too easy, right? So cleaning has to be something that's actually work, right? So what? How's that even possible that I have these little helpers that just do the work for me, right? So I had to really break through all of these barriers to accept that, and many more things. We could explore the endocrinological differences between men and women and all of that. But um, it, you said you believe that land can recover in 3 years, and
Oh,
soil can recover in 3 years, and of course, if you give it more time, even better. And that is exactly also mirroring my experience from farmers that I know and land that I know. Now, do you think um, we can recover this intergenerational interbeing at the same speed? Is that something that's possible?
I think it's absolutely possible, but I feel that there's this intuitive turning where we are actually in my book Ancient Futures. I talk about that. I talk about ancient futures micro trends. In many ways, without knowing it, we're finding our way back home. to the more natural, to the more truly life affirming and joyous and meaningful way of doing things. But I think there's a lack of understanding and a lack of emphasis on the need to reestablish that. So I see a lot of my colleagues, indigenous colleagues, talking almost exclusively, well, I would say exclusively, a lot of them are talking about their connection to nature and not so much about the need to rebuild the social fabric and always emphasizing the intergenerational. That I don't see enough awareness of. And yet there are beautiful examples. I remember, one that, I loved was apparently in Holland, I think it was, that young people had been given quite an inexpensive room in a center where there were old people. And so if they spent some time with those old people, they could live very inexpensively. And then the report was they loved it so much, they were spending much more time than they needed. And so those are the stories that warm the heart.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And this points in a interesting and sometimes a difficult direction. I encounter again and again people, mainly in cities, because people in the rural areas all over the world seem to be or still much more closer to this and see this with more ease.
I don't think so. By the way, I don't agree with that, but let's come back to that.
Okay, we can discuss
Yeah.
that. But what I notice is that especially young families seem to have an urge, like you just described, but they don't know where to start.
Yeah.
Right? They don't have the funds to just pack up and leave and start and buy a piece of land so that they can, and then so they don't have the funds. Then they lack the courage because the story is so strong.
Yeah.
And they lack the knowledge, and all of these elements that go into actually being a villager, right? So because many people urge for the village, but not many people actually want to do the work of the villager, right? That's something that they need to go into. So now the question is, what would you recommend to a young family, be it in the city or in the countryside, that has this intuition that you're just describing? What's like the first microscopic step that they can take in their
with
life?
almost everything, the first microscopic step would be to try to find some like-minded others.
Mm-hmm.
And so in our sort of work, which has spread, and people will have put up well, they used to put up flyers to say, come to a showing of the Ancient Futures film or the Economics of Happiness, and as a way of finding like-minded people, which now, it could be a Facebook call out. Right now we're supporting a young man here who's doing that, to find like-minded people. Are you interested in in this, discussing, I don't know how much detail you need to go to start, but you can decide to do a showing of one of these films and then have a discussion afterwards about meeting. So my favorite stories of this kind of thing have been people like, there was one group in Dublin, I'm not sure now, haven't stayed in touch, it's a long time ago, but they realized how important it was to find like-minded people. And so they spent a year in Dublin meeting and having a group that grew, and some people left, and it kept, the consensus grew so that they then moved out as a village onto the land. Because we need to change the I to a we, and one tiny nuclear family isn't enough. In South Korea, my book was a bestseller, and it was shown it was maybe still is in schools. And when I came back a year or so later, I was told that many young people inspired by it had moved out to start growing food and so on, but they hadn't really, looked at what I'm saying, which is you first need to ensure that you at least have some community that want to buy your food. So try in the city or on Facebook or whatever to establish a we. And so if you want to go out and grow food, set up some kind of CSA or find a market or a shop that really will value your very valuable products. But don't try to go out and do it alone. And I think for me, this is what went wrong with the hippie movement, is that in effect, I would say we hadn't learned enough from indigenous culture to really understand what it takes. It just takes more than one nuclear family, or it takes more than a monoculture of hippies, not intergenerational and like, with Osho followers set up a lot of communities, but they were anti-children, which is so unnatural. And so, yeah.
Okay, so we find the others. What are powerful symbols, you would say, that help us find the others? I'm reminded of Serbia when they tried to get rid of Milosevic. What they did at one point is they took their television sets for walks in the evening during the time in which the national propaganda news were being shown. So this was a powerful symbol to show everybody you're not watching this. And I'm wondering what could be the symbol people today can use to signal to each other in a very light and easy, maybe even fun way to say, hey, I have the same intuition as you do. What would you see as symbols that we could use?
Well, I don't know. We'd have to think about that. That's, sort of the whole concept of being a villager and so on has started taking off. But I think it could be, you see, I'm really wanting us to not only signal to each other that we want to move in this direction and live in a fundamentally different way, but I'm also wanting people to say a clear no to Milosevic, which is now a global empire and a machine-like empire where algorithms are these metal soldiers that are fighting life and exterminating life and polarizing us. And so a clear no to that polarization, and with very concrete ideas about how we deal with it, because we are also offering that. And so our campaign in Sweden is, and in a sense, right now, that may be the most urgent and important thing, is to stop the warfare. And because, we're talking about permanent war, real war, and we have to really step back to understand that we're being subjected to a warfare against us that polarizes us and separates us. And the warfare is not just to polarize us around gender, around every possible politics of identity, every single possibility. Handicapped has to be a separate group, and this has to be polarizing, dividing, but also the time pressure. The time pressure may be the biggest weapon of this war machine to destroy us, because it prevents us from even having the time to take a breath and look at the connections. And it pushes us then into this fragmented, polarizing, angry, and, passionate adherence to one particular element. So I often say that the time pressure may be the, and that of course is entirely linked to technology. So,
Mhm.
so I'm wanting I'm wanting a symbol, which I try to call it big picture activism. And the big picture includes not just the machine and its monstrous, evil ways of operating, but the incredible plethora of positive signs that people want something else, that people are doing something else, very often led by women, grassroots, and it's very intuitive. It's very beautiful, but for me, frustrating that many of the most beautiful women I know who are trying to lead the way to a more feminine, village-based, earth-based way of living, because they're so ignorant of the ultimately male-created machine, they're not as, it's not nearly as strong and good as it could be. And they end up, we all end up victims of regulations that prevent, an eco-village. Oh, no, we don't want urban sprawl. Oh, you want to bring in a few million or 100 million to build, a suburb? Red carpet, we'll build you a little road and an off-ramp. It's just, the local governments don't even have the right to say no to the big developers, and they're spending all their time policing the small, the healthy, the ecological. It's so sad. And it's so sad to me that many of my intelligent environmental activists, even when I've talked until I'm blue in the face, they don't take up the big picture. And instead, like now, one of them, well, maybe you heard him, Christian, that I was speaking with.
Yeah.
So he's, the son of a billionaire, and I love him dearly. He's adorable. But even, as much, and he tells me I'm his great inspiration, and I should be, but he still doesn't get it. So he's trying to do everything as a business. And so he said, I hear you about infrastructure. When I'm talking about infrastructure, our taxes paying the opposite of what we want. But now he's going to, in his project, he's going to be building infrastructure, but all of it for profit. And I'm trying to explain, in this casino, for profit is that which pollutes more, uses more resources, and punishes you if you employ people. That's
Fully
the game
agree.
you're operating in.
That's where the exploitation machinery starts. As soon as you go for profit, you're in the wrong direction. There's no exception.
Yeah.
So what would you think, going back to that family with the hunch,
Yeah.
what would you think of them, instead of trying to find the like-minded and build the village somewhere isolated and then trying to find some land, if they went to find a village? That was what Joe Brewer told me many years ago when I was contemplating creating an intentional community. And he said, well, there's actually no point. All you do is you find a village and you help that village heal.
That's definitely something that's happening, but I haven't actually seen groups of people doing it. I know, he and another friend. I mean, actually, I don't even really know Joe that well, but he was part of that thing with Al Noor. You said you knew about Al Noor, or
Yeah,
not?
I don't know him personally.
Yeah. Anyway, what was so I think, we have to be really careful when we say find a village. Are we really conquering, the few people who are left? But there are these villages now, as you know, in Spain and even Italy and so on, that are abandoned, and that where the local council, some people I just spoke to the other day, are in the north of Spain, and apparently the local council is really welcoming them. And so you can get a certain amount of infrastructure, but you're not going to be getting the economic support you need. So I would urge people to try to build up the number of like-minded people. So maybe investigate if there are some villages around where the people who are still living there would welcome this kind of, which is, I was just telling someone yesterday about this, what I see. Yeah, it's a Swedish filmmaker who was here. And there's a tendency, even for the, in France, they used to call it nouveau rural, the new rurals.
Mm-hmm.
So this is because it's an ancient futurist trend. People who've tasted life in the city want out. And very often those who've had, earned a lot of money, as you know, particularly from the tech industry and so on, they want
Mm-hmm.
out. So this trend is happening, and very often people demonize themselves. So the new rurals who come from the urban center start romanticizing the old local,
Mm-hmm.
and the old local people who never left the village or never left the area are often not very open-minded. They've been marginalized for centuries. Farming has been considered nothing. It's not, they've been considered nothing. So they often have become xenophobic, close-minded. And this is also our problem, talking about localization. A lot of urban lefties, they can't understand. They think we're right wing. So they,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't take the time to really look at what we're saying. But what I'm saying, honestly, I mean, my friend Wendell Berry would not agree and wouldn't like my saying this, but my experience is that the old local, in other words, the people who lived in the village, never left, tend on the whole to be fairly xenophobic. And if you like, in a certain way, easily manipulated by the right wing. And so but the beautiful thing I've seen is, in setting up farmers markets and so on, is that we have this wonderful, clear path towards healing and disregarding those party politics, and the farmers who are now suddenly giving food to greenies who don't care if one apple has a black mark on it, because it's a sign that they didn't spray. They don't care if they're all different sizes. It's like a beautiful, beautiful thing to see in farmers markets, that coming together of left and right. And that kind of thing could also be happening in villages if the people coming in would be big picture, deeply tolerant, compassionate, and wanting to collaborate and to create, a real community. And yeah, but
Yeah.
they shouldn't. What often happens is they tend to demonize the newcomers and romanticize the locals, which is not helpful either. We need to be open-eyed and honest and discerning.
Which I think deserves its own full conversation around the
Yeah,
in-group, out-group dynamics, and
yeah,
the question of which I think you can definitely speak to in the sense of going deep in multiple places on the planet, being
yeah,
accepted in multiple places on the planet.
yeah,
How is that done? How is that? How this be part of the cultural fabric? How can this be maintained over generations?
yeah,
That there's a some sort of a membrane around your community, but at the same time, there's this membrane has the ability to open up to strangers and
yeah,
invite strangers in,
yeah,
right? But also reject some, which is also healthy.
yeah, yeah.
How,
By the way, I have to say I'm sort of falling in love with you. I'm very surprised at how knowledgeable you are. I didn't expect that from the
thank you,
meeting at Catapult. Very,
thank you.
very impressed.
That's
Yeah.
that's
I
that's
hope,
beautiful.
yeah, I
I
hope
feel
we can
flattered.
meet up in person.
We will,
Very, very
for sure.
nice to get to know you. I should stop.